Just in case you're coming back from wherever we all have been our summers, and we're everywhere. I feel like summertime, you're everywhere, and you're nowhere. We're cramming in vacations. It's that time of the year. Let me just give you a little reminder. Acts is, yes, telling the story of the first church, but it's telling our story. That's what's the glorious news about the Bible. It's living and active, and it's good for us today. This is telling the story of the movement that God has created and is working even here at First Baptist Church of Woodbridge. And here's what we see. We see Paul and Barnabas at the beginning of Acts chapter 14 here, and they're walking through the door. They are jiggling handles is where we left off last week. They're praying for open doors, looking for open doors, and they're walking out into this world, leaving the worship centers, so to speak, of their churches, and they are heading to towns. They're heading to cities. They're finding people. And here what we see at the beginning of Acts 14 is that they're about to make their way into 3 different little areas, a region of Galatia, into these 3 towns. Let's look at what happens here as Paul and Barnabas go out. Look in verse 1. It says, "Now at Iconium they entered together into the Jewish synagogue and spoke in such a way that a great number of both Jews and Greeks believed." What a great reminder of last week. I mean, God can open doors. We ought to go share the gospel, yes, because He tells us to, and make disciples, yes, because Jesus said so. But also because, you know what? God does work. Where the gospel is preached, people respond. And what you see in Acts here is that this is given to us in example after example after example. Synagogues are open. Preach to us a word of encouragement. They do, and people respond. But I want you to notice something else that happens here. Starting in verse 2, look at this. It says, "But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. So they remained for a long time speaking boldly for the Lord, who bore witness to the word of His grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. But the people of the city were divided. So some sided with the Jews and some with the apostles. When an attempt was made by both Gentiles and Jews with their rulers to mistreat them and to stone them, they learned of it and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Laconia, and to the surrounding country, and there they continued to preach the gospel." Now they moved to the second town. Now at Lystra there was a man sitting who could not use his feet. He was crippled from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul speaking, and Paul, looking intently at him and seeing that he had faith to be made well, said in a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And he sprang up and began walking. And when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in Lycaonian, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." Barnabas they started calling Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus, whose temple was at the entrance to the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifice to it the crowds. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, they tore their garments and rushed out into the crowd, crying out, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men of like nature with you, and we bring you good news that you should turn from these vain things to a living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. In past generations, He allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways. Yes, He did not leave Himself without witness. For He did good by giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness. Even with these words, they scarcely restrained the people from offering sacrifice to them. But Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and having persuaded the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. But when the disciples gathered around him, he rose up, entered the city, and on the next day he went on with Barnabas to Derbe. And when they had preached the gospel to the city and had made many disciples, they returned to Lystra and Iconium and Antioch, strengthening the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue in the faith, and saying that through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. And when they had appointed elders from them in every church, with prayer and fasting, they committed them to the Lord in whom they had believed. Then they passed through Pisidia and came to Pamphylia. And when they had spoken the word in Perga, they went down to Italia. And from there they sailed to Antioch, where they had been commanded to the grace of God for the work that had been fulfilled. And when they arrived and gathered the church together, they declared all that God had done with them, and how He had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles. And they remained no little time with the disciples. It's interesting. You pay attention to all of these chapters. So at the point we get to chapter 8, here's what God does. He shoves the church out into the waters of the world. Choppy, dark, depraved, disengaged from from God's mission for the planet. And here's what you start noticing. You notice this, like a James Montgomery Boyce, you would read, he says, I notice a pattern with how they went about doing ministry. Here we are at First Baptist Church of Woodbridge, and you have a pastor who's trying to just tell you what Jesus is telling us in his word that he has planned for our church. And here's what it is. I've summarized it down to really 2 words, go and tell. Go and tell. Our call is to take everything that he's calling us to do here. We're supposed to gather together as a body of believers. That's what we learned last week. We are supposed to be submitting ourselves to the teaching of his word, encouraging one another, holding each other accountable, confessing to one another, using our gifts, serving one another, worshiping together, singing spiritual songs to one another, so that we take all of what we're doing inside here, like we learned last week, though, and get to the most important location in our church. We go to those doors, just like these brothers, and say, now it's time to take what we do in here out to the streets. Otherwise, what's the point? What's the point of doing all this stuff that we do in here to encourage one another and yet not fulfill the mission we've been given? The mission was to go and tell. Now, the interesting thing is you begin to look at how they did this. You start to notice a pattern. And it wasn't just a pattern for these first disciples who dared to walk outside these doors. It still holds true today. I want to show you this. James Montgomery Boyce would say every single time that these disciples, whether here it was Paul and Barnabas in chapter 14, or it was Peter and Paul and the rest of the apostles, they went out, and here's the first thing they did is they began to minister. There's a million books out there that would tell you how to go about being a Great Commission church. There's a million pastors and sermons out there that people will tell you, here's the steps to growing your church or reaching your community. We have a 4-step process here we see with these apostles. And the first step was this. Get a load of this. You can write this down. It's important. Preach the gospel. And that's all of our jobs. If you're sitting in this place and you know Jesus Christ is your Lord and Savior, you would dare to say that you are a follower, a disciple of Jesus. Let me tell you what your ministry is. One part of that, a big part of that, is to go wherever God takes you. In your home, your office, your workout facility, across the street, and across the oceans, your job is to preach the good news, the glorious good news of Jesus Christ. To be witnesses is our mandate. I think a lot of people, even in our country, would be confused about it. They say, no, I thought that was your job, Pastor Brad. You're the pastor. You're the preacher. Nope, it's all of ours. Paul told the church at Corinth that your job is to be an ambassador of Christ, that you are a spokesman. Wherever you go, you don't take the badge off. You are a representative of the kingdom of heaven for Christ Jesus. So therefore, everything you do, everything you say, whether people see it or not, is an opportunity to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. And let me just emphasize this, because I think people get confused even in the church sometimes. And that includes your mouth, mainly your mouth. There are people that like to take, a quote and misapply it to St. Francis of Assisi. People love it. I've heard it so many times in the church, and it's close to being right, but it's not. They will say, you know what, I want to preach the gospel, and if necessary, use words. And that sounds good, and it's cute. Problem is, it's not biblical. It's close, though. Again, like we talked about last week, I think so many times we tend to be either or kinds of people. It's not a matter of, I'm going to be the person. I hear people say, you know what that quote means is that I'm going to go out and I'm going to preach the gospel just by living for Jesus. And people will notice that. And that's true, by the way. People can notice fruit in your life. They can witness the work of the Holy Spirit in you. You should recognize love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. And they can notice something's different about you. But make no mistake, God intends for you, as we look at Scripture, for you to also, it's not either or, like I do that, but I don't use my mouth at all. No. You do that, and my goodness, definitely use your words to preach the gospel. I mean, Paul tells the church at Rome, how will they know unless they believe? And how will they believe unless somebody what? Tells them. I wonder how many of you came to know Jesus Christ without somebody telling you about Jesus. I wonder how many of you came to know Jesus Christ by just watching somebody who didn't say Jesus' name, but just lived for him, and you got on your knees and said, Jesus, I believe that you died on the cross to pay the penalty for my sin. Let me tell you the pattern that we see here. The apostles would walk into a synagogue, they would walk into a living room, they would walk into a crowd of people, they would find, Paul had a knack for saying, I've got a new town, where's the busiest part of town? And he would walk into the middle of the town, and he would start what first? Preaching the gospel, unadulterated gospel. I think there's some people who would even look at it in the first century and say, well, shouldn't we do signs and wonders first? I feel like that'd be a better method. Do something awesome like heal a leper and get the crowds here. And I will say this, there is something to that too. You look in Scripture and that God did. We see it even in this chapter. He used, especially for this first set of believers who didn't have a New Testament, He used signs and wonders to absolutely authenticate His believers and His power. But almost, if not every single time, that happened at very least simultaneously to preaching the gospel or afterwards. So many times I see people who would say, you know what, if we want to be a Great Commission church, let me tell you the strategy. The strategy, Brad, is very pragmatic. Let's not go out there first with the Bible. You'll have whole pastors these days who are at big mega churches, and their strategy is actually not to quote the Bible. Even if they quote the Bible, they want to make sure to not put the Bible references there in the sermon because that'll scare people away. It'll scare people away. And they'll use terms like this. Mega pastors that books out there selling and say, we need to unhitch our wagon from the Old Testament. Just people don't want to hear that, so let's not talk about it anymore. Let's do things that would get people here with very pragmatic things. Maybe it's entertainment. Maybe it's giving away things. Let's get them here. And here's the trap they fall into is that, you know what you win people with is what they come for. It's what they stay for. And here's the deal. That might work for getting a big crowd together a lot of times. It might. For filling seats in a room, it may work for that. I don't think it's the best. It's not biblical, and it's not an effective strategy for having people's lives transformed into the image of Jesus Christ, for making disciples of Jesus. Our goal here at First Baptist Church as a church that is trying to please the Lord Jesus is to make disciples, not draw a crowd. Now, I'm not opposed to drawing a crowd. I pray God would sweep through our city in a way where we would have to figure out what we're doing here. We're out of space, but not at the sacrifice of the gospel. What good is it, friends, for somebody to have a good service, an entertaining show, and forfeit their soul? What good is it for a leper to no longer be a leper, but they never got around to sharing the gospel, and they'll die and their soul is forfeited for all of eternity? You notice something here. They went into every town and they began to preach the gospel. That is your duty. And let me tell you what, we look at the church today and we would say in the United States of America, the church is declining. For every 6 churches that we start this year, 10 to 12 will close. There's a good 15, they would say, to 20% of churches in the last year and a half that will have closed their doors. And you would look at that, and a lot of people have their very pragmatic reasons for why that is. They're not doing this, they should do this, they made this decision with their service or their worship style and all these things. Let me tell you what I think the number one reason is. Because the churches, I believe this with all of my heart, has sacrificed the first important method for making disciples. They have stopped preaching the gospel. Might have pastors preaching the gospel from the pulpit, but let me tell you something. The world, it is not a strategy that works anymore in 2021 for open the doors and they will come. The church, by and large, I would look at the United States of America, and when we leave the doors of the sanctuary, which is dwindling and dwindling, the rates of people coming to church are 1 every 3 Sundays. When we walk out of here, I wonder if we are walking out of this location and sharing the gospel with people. I don't think so. We learned last week why that is. That there's a lot of people who say, you know what, I don't want to jiggle handles, and I don't want to walk from inside the church here. Let me pull this. I know Pastor Andrew normally does this for me, but he pulled his back out. So this is why it didn't get pulled over this morning. Because we spend all our time in here, and there are people who don't want to walk through this door. They don't want to walk through this door because they're afraid of what they're going to find on the other side of it. They're afraid they're going to find rejection. They're afraid they're going to find persecution. They're afraid they're going to find difficulty. And let me just tell you something, you will. That's what we see here in Acts 14. The first method that we have for reaching our community with the gospel is to preach the gospel. But let me tell you something else you see. Here's the pattern of ministry, how it unfolded here for Paul and Barnabas and how it folded every single time they went somewhere new to share the gospel. Every single time we have the audacity, or any follower of Christ has the audacity to preach the gospel. Let me tell you what the second part of pattern of ministry is that you ought to expect. Division. Divisiveness. You preach the gospel courageously and boldly. Let me tell you what, it's going to create division. Wherever you go and be light, let me tell you what light does. A couple of things. Yes, light does some good things. You take a place that's completely dark and barren, and you shine light on it and the sunlight on it for a little while, it'll start to warm things up. It'll start to produce life. It'll start to produce growth. That's glorious. That ought to keep us fueled. That, you know what? Our job is to go out and be a city on a hill and not hide our light under a basket. We're to go shine the light in the midst of a dark and depraved world, like Philippians says, because we know that the gospel will produce growth. But let me tell you what else is guaranteed to produce that Jesus warned us. Division. That you are going to have people who are creatures of the darkness. When you shine light on creatures in the darkness, what do those creatures do? Scatter. You turn a flashlight on, you start seeing bugs running everywhere, cockroaches. They don't like the light. This happens here. I mean, we see it even John 3. I know we know John 3:16. Look, it's the gospel. God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. Whoever believe in Him and have eternal life, that's great. Then He gives us the same warning. This is the message we're supposed to take for everybody. In John 3:19, He says this, "And this is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and the people loved the darkness rather than the light because their works were evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his works should be exposed. But whoever does what is true comes to the light so that it may be clearly seen that his works have been carried out in God." Let me tell you what, in order to go out, if you have the audacity to go share the good news with people, you can't share the good news in Jesus without sharing the bad news. People don't like that in this world. In order for me to come to know Jesus Christ, I have to admit that I need Jesus. And the reason why I need Jesus is because I'm hopelessly sinful. People in our world would say, no, I'm not. And they'll scatter. There's going to be division. You can bank on it. There are people who would say, I don't want to go share the gospel because I think we're going to have divisiveness. And people are not going to like that message. Guaranteed, some will and some won't. There's a third thing we see, though. That this wasn't the end of the story as these apostles, these disciples, including us, as we go out and we have the audacity to, even in love, speak the truth in love, the gospel in love, we can experience division, but even more than that. Because you see these creatures that scatter in the dark, not only do they scatter from the dark, they don't like the fact that you're messing with their darkness. And so the third ministry pattern that we see with every single time when these disciples shared the gospel and they walked into a town, they only had division, but it increased to persecution was the third pattern of ministry that we see. We ought to expect it. When you walk through this door with the anticipation of going and living your life for Jesus and telling people about Jesus, some people aren't going to want to hear it and they aren't going to want to listen to you. They're not going to want to be your friend. And not only that, though, they're going to try to shut you up. Bank on it. Jesus said it. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you. Reminded us here, Paul's trying to remind the church, salvation comes through great tribulation. These creatures of the dark don't like having their territory messed with. So they try to stop you from shining the light. It's happened all through redemptive history, sometimes by people chopping people's heads off, shooting them, firing them, jailing them, making fun of them, talking harshly about them. I mean, it comes in a lot of different forms. We expect, Paul expected it. And he had to run from town to town. Every time he went and shared the gospel, even the towns that he had great success in, what often happened with Paul, people chased him and threw rocks at his head until they thought he was dead. I love Paul. That brother would just get up and start preaching again. Paul never stayed anywhere. The longest he ever stayed somewhere was Ephesus. He stayed somewhere a year and a half. Why? Because people were chasing him everywhere. I think a lot of times we don't want to be a Great Commission church. We don't want to be a go and tell church. Even in the United States of America. Why? Because we don't like rejection. Because we don't like the idea that there might be division. Because somebody might maybe persecute us. We don't like a lot less than that. Now here's the fourth thing, and I don't want to miss this. This is the point I want to get to. Neither one of those are big selling points for why we ought to go out and preach the gospel. There's a fourth part, though. Guaranteed we can expect division, we can expect persecution, but here's another thing that we ought to be expecting, and it's guaranteed. A fourth pattern of ministry that we see in all of these churches we've been reading about is growth. Growth. Even here, even in the midst of the vision, even in the midst of the persecution, even in the midst of them trying to stone him, he got up, went and preached the gospel, and what happened in verse 21? Preached the gospel, and guess what? Many people became disciples. Even if it started with, like Philippi with a bunch of ladies and a group of 5 or 6, what it blew up. There's 2.5 billion Christians in the world today. Because God makes us a promise that if we'll go share the gospel, we can expect division, we can expect persecution, but we can expect growth. Wherever the gospel is preached, people will respond. The gospel, the word, will not return void. It's never a waste of time. And if I've got anything to share with you after 25 years of knowing the Lord Jesus, look, there have been hard times. There are people that have been ugly. There have been people that have ignored. There have been people who said things. Yes, there's been lots of division, lots more doors shut in my face than open in my face, but I can tell you this without a shadow of a doubt, it has all been worth it. Because they didn't all shut the door. In my house, I've preached the gospel and people have responded. And that right there is enough for me. It means everything. Cousins that we sat on the porch in Reeves, Louisiana, share the gospel and they respond. Strangers sit in gas stations in Haiti and share the gospel, and there's gospel growth. The word does change people's lives. And so whatever I go through for the cause of Jesus Christ, it's worth it, because nothing compares to knowing Jesus, is what Paul said in Philippians 3. Paul says, "For I have considered all things lost compared to the all-surpassing power of knowing Jesus." If I know that there is no treasure, literally nothing in this world that compares to knowing Jesus, why would I not want everybody to know that? There's nothing better than knowing him, and the world needs to know this. We see a pattern here. This ought to be the pattern of our church. If we're going to have a pattern, we're going to have a way to go forward in ministry to be a go and tell church in 2021, 2022, I think it ought to be biblical. We are going to involve ourselves this year. You're going to hear it on September 12th at Vision Sunday. We are going to be finding ways to train ourselves. I would love it. You're going to hear a certain percentage of our church that I want to be able to, by the end of the year, a certain percentage of our active membership have gone through training to be able to actively share the gospel of Jesus Christ, and they have participated in that in some form or fashion here in Woodbridge by the end of the year. Prepare ourselves like Paul did. Prepare ourselves. Teach them. They constantly were preparing the church to know that, oh, by the way, you're going to experience pushback. You're going to experience persecution. We want to prepare you for that. That's why you need training. Begin to look at this, and here's what we see in chapter 14 as we kind of want to get to the point of this. In chapter 14, what do we begin to see? We begin to see what is seemingly closed doors. Sometimes the door is wide open, man, and it is just people coming to know the Lord. There, Acts chapter 2, 14,000, 3,000. It's amazing. Sometimes we pray for open doors, and they look closed, like William Carey with India, and we have to jiggle handles. Sometimes we have to really pull hard. We have to keep working until it cracks open. It looks like closed doors sometimes. We don't quit. What do we learn from this? Even when the door looks closed, we don't quit. We keep moving. We keep going because there is growth on the other side of this. Sometimes it's 1,000. Sometimes it's 1. Sometimes it takes a day. Sometimes it takes 5 years. You see this. What did they encounter here as they went to Iconium? They came to this first town. And it says that they experienced division. It says now they entered together into the Jewish synagogue and spoke in such a way that a great number of both Jews and Greeks believed. Things are going great. This is going to be fantastic. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. It says here, in as you continue on in that verse, look at verse 3. It says, so they remained for a long time speaking boldly of the Lord, who bore witness to the word of his grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. But the people of the city were divided. Went in, preached the gospel, division here. Then they move on down the road to Lystra. And what happens there? Bizarreness. Not only was there preaching of the gospel, and there was a miracle, and there was division, now there's also just worldly confusion thrown into the mix. They preach the gospel, and the people are loving it, eating it up with a spoon. This is amazing. They start coming out of their houses with birds and animals to sacrifice. And you know there was a part where maybe Paul and Barnabas were like, this is awesome. They're going to sacrifice to the Lord. And then it dawns on them, no, they came out here to sacrifice to us. You've missed the whole point. That's how the enemy works. Sometimes it's just create division. Sometimes he works to create confusion. He loves it when people love your message just as long as they don't get to the X at the end of the treasure map. We love your message. We don't want to follow Jesus as God. We just would rather believe you're God. And they tore their clothes to think, we've wasted our time. You've missed the point. Closed door. Then the people from Iconium and Antioch won't leave Paul alone. They come to Lystra. Kill him within an inch of his life. You can't get a bigger closed door than that. You would think there'd be a point where Paul would say, you know what? I've tried. It ain't working. Let's quit. That's what I want to encourage you with, actually, as we talk about this. Look, all of this was predicted by Jesus for his first disciples before he even left. The whole sermon, everything I've preached up to this point, Jesus actually summed all of this up in one parable. Matthew chapter 13, here's what Jesus says about you and me and our church. He said this. He says, here's what your job is and my job. It is to be sowers, farmers. We don't use sowers. Your job is to be a farmer. My job is to be a farmer. And my job on the farm and your job on the farm is to literally do this. This is our job as a church. Take the seed of the gospel and scatter it. I don't have to plant it. I don't have to make it grow. I don't even have the ability to do that. I'm just scattering. My kids will ask me sometimes. It's confusing to them when they were little. Okay, Dad, what is your job, though? And it's hard to sum that up in a sentence. And so my sentence is, my job is to tell people about Jesus. And you might be sitting in this room, you might be a banker, you might be a CEO, you might be flipping burgers at Burger King. And let me tell you what, that's how you get paid, but let me tell you what your job is. It is to share the seed of the glorious gospel of Jesus Christ and scatter it. And Jesus already said, if that's our job, he says, but you know what, it's going to be tough. 75% of everywhere you throw the seed, it ain't going to take root and grow. That's what Jesus says. Thank goodness that they didn't scare the first disciples to be like, I'm only going to get at best a 25% return on my work. I quit. I don't want to do it. You wouldn't exist. I wouldn't exist. He says, you know what? There's going to be seed there. It says in Matthew 13, he says, when we throw that seed, there will be a whole group of people. It's going to land on this hardened path like concrete. And it never gets below the surface. And so it sits there and immediately you throw the seed, boop, birds come and snatch it up. He says, then there's going to be 25% of the seed that you scatter out there, and it's going to be in this rocky ground where there's barely any dirt there, maybe a little bit, but there's a lot of rocks. And so it might barely get down in the ground, but there ain't enough dirt there for it to grow. The rocks just won't allow it to happen. He says, so then there's another 25% you throw out on this, what he calls thorny ground or weedy ground. He says there is good soil there, but also equally there's weeds that are growing here. In the weeds, over time, the thorny stuff takes over all the growth that might be happening in the good soil and chokes it out. And then he says there is at best 25% over here where it falls on good soil. And the way we know it's good soil is, he says, because it produces fruit. Some 100, some 60, some 30. But the reason why we know it has roots is because it is producing fruit. You can't grow fruit if the roots haven't gone down in the ground. This is what he tells us here. And then Jesus explains the parable. Listen to this in Matthew 13, 18 through 23. Jesus says this. Here then is the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is what was sown along the path. As for what was sown on the rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet he has no root in himself, but endures for a while, and then tribulation or persecution arises on account of the word, and immediately he falls away. As for those sown amongst the thorns, that is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. As for what was sown on the good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it, and indeed bears the fruit and yields, in one case 100-fold, and another 60, and then another 30. Here's what he says, that there are a lot of people who won't want to walk through this door because they already know that there are three groups of people. I mean, I tell people they might be sitting in this congregation this morning, that I'm sitting here sharing the truth of God's word, and there are 75% of people who might be sitting here, and you fall into three categories where ultimately they're not going to know the Lord Jesus Christ and respond. One, because they'll be snatched away by Satan, Jesus says. That we have a real enemy who is working overtime to make sure that the people don't respond to the gospel. Two, I also think there's just a hard-heartedness that comes with this. Like that hard path. We all have sin in our life. Our hearts are just naturally hardened to the gospel. I mean, think of the Pharisees. Jesus experienced this. Jesus would go and he preached the gospel. And even the Pharisees might have been a little interested, but what happened? Immediately their hard-heartedness stopped them from receiving the truth of the gospel. Why? Because Jesus had the audacity to hang out with these sinners. He had the audacity to forgive people's sins. And he really had the audacity to say that their made-up traditions and laws didn't matter. And therefore, their hard-heartedness not only made them divided, but hate him and persecute him. It happened in his own hometown with his own family. Later in this chapter, in Matthew 13, what happened? Jesus goes home, and they initially are in awe. Look there in verses 53 and in 54, it says that they were looking, where did he get the wisdom to say these kinds of things? And then immediately their sin starts to kick in. Yeah, but isn't his mom Mary? And aren't his brothers and his sisters live here? His dad was a carpenter. Oh, by the way, they at that time all thought he was crazy too. Surely nothing good comes from Nazareth. And then it says that they what? Then they, verse 57, took offense at him. They moved from awe to offense in 4 verses. There are people in the world that from the get-go are never even going to listen to the gospel. Like Romans 1 says, what is God made clearly visible and his invisible attributes. People know God, but they suppress it with their sin and unrighteousness. We should expect that. He says that there will be times where we go share the gospel. We're going to go and tell into our community. And what will we find? Rocky ground. This is Virginia. Literally, it's rocky ground. We don't have ground like this in Louisiana. We just don't. I put a fence up in my backyard a couple of years ago. And let me tell you what I found. Every third move with that post hole digger, it wasn't just like a pebble in there. Rocks. I'm like, there's no dirt in here. It's all rocks. And let me tell you what it made me want to do. Not build the fence. That's what it made me want to do. After about the second post, my hands are just blistered. I haven't gotten anywhere. I'm not sure. I'm like now saying I was going to go 2 feet down. I'm like, I think 12 inches is good. We don't need to go down 2 feet. How windy could it get? I'm making excuses. About halfway through, I'm like, I kind of like the no fence look. Let's just go no fences. Let them run. We don't have animals. Let me tell you what, the rocky ground's frustrating for people sharing the gospel. There are people who might love the idea of following the gospel. You go out and preach the gospel, and when it's popular, they love it. They love freedom. They love forgiveness. They don't want to admit that they're a sinner, and they certainly don't love the gospel when it starts costing them their job, costing them popularity, costing them their life. There are people who will love the gospel when it's great. It's like people who love the New England Patriots all these years, and all of a sudden now it got real quiet over the last couple of years. When things got rough, well, I'm not in for that. I'm only in for the good stuff. We will find people like that all the time. The church will be flourishing, and let people start getting killed, those numbers dwindle to a remnant. And what it does is the persecution will expose what? That they had no roots. They liked the benefits of being around Jesus. They just didn't know Jesus. Then there's a third group, and I think we ought to pay attention to this third group because I think this is the United States of America. Thorny ground. You see that rocky group, they're not necessarily hard like the first group, they're just shallow. We find ourselves in a group here, in a thorny ground group where we preach. This is the mission field that God's called me to. A group where there is soil. There is good, receptive news to the gospel, but it's not persecution that causes the church to dwindle in the United States of America. I mean, what's fascinating is you've got churches that are either growing or stalling out or maybe declining a little bit in really persecuted places. And yet we're declining faster here, and we don't really experience that level of persecution at all. What is it? It is thorns and weeds. And here's what Jesus says those weeds and thorns are. Love for the world. Both are here. All the fertile soil of Jesus, and yet but there's all this love of money and comfort and affluence, and the cares of the world have now choked out what the gospel receptiveness would have been in my life. Oh, we need to pay attention to that. care more about the things of the world than they care about Jesus. I love it. I was reading a pastor, Douglas O'Donnell. He said this. He said, into the last century, there was a historian named Martin Marty who called evangelicals this. He says, the evangelicals are the most worldly people in America. He says, listen to this. Each Sunday, evangelicals around America sing songs like I Surrender All, or like our first service, I'd rather have Jesus than silver and gold. But 80% of us give an average of about 2 to 3% of our income, and 20% don't give anything at all. He says, so if I'm at a church where the average income for people is $120,000 a year, 2 to 3% is somewhere around $3,000 out of the pocket we give to others. These are people who claim to be Christians. Where on earth is the rest of the money going? I'll tell you where it's going. It's going to lining their coffins. You can't take it with you to heaven, but you can sure take it with you to hell. Don't think you can trust money and get into heaven. Don't think you can treasure earthly treasures and still inherit the eternal pleasures of God. Friendship with the world, James says in 4:4, is enmity with God. If money is your best friend, God is not. And while riches and money are not the problem, what love for it can do to your heart will stifle the gospel. You need to pay attention. These are the ground. And then there is this one, and this is what I want to end with. There is a reason to keep going, though, and share the gospel, because there is good soil that God has prepared. The reason why we go jiggle handles is because there's good soil, because somebody shared the gospel with you, and it took. You're still here. You know, the gospel is not a prayer you pray one time. The mark of a true disciple isn't that they go back and be like, hey, one time when I was 6, I prayed this prayer, that's it. No, the mark of a disciple is that today you are daily picking up your cross, taking your cross, being crucified with Christ, and following Jesus. We preach the gospel because he says that even when it seems like there are closed doors, they're not all closed. There will be fruit here to be had. Verse 21, it says that he got up from being falsely attributed as a god, division and arguing, and being almost murdered. And it says that when he preached the gospel in the city of Derbe, they made many disciples. Let me just say this as we come to an end. I think there was a tendency, part of me wanted to kind of look at our service and say, let me give you now a 5-point reminders on how I can encourage you when you experience rejection. When we go in and we share the gospel, here's what you can do. Don't quit. That's good advice. Remember God's grace. Remember who you were. Keep all these things. But you know what? God put a 1-point kind of reminder for our time together. I started thinking about why it is that people will quit sharing the gospel, or why it is that they won't walk through that door, and why it is that they don't want to do what God's called us to do, and why they fear rejection so much. And the truth is, I think it's because they have forgotten who they are, and they've forgotten whose they are. The reason the gospel is not being preached from churches in North America, the reason why is really not because we're afraid of rejection. It's not because we're afraid of persecution. The real root of the reason why we're afraid is because we have forgotten who God is. There is only one thing we should be afraid of. One thing that we should fear. God. Romans 8:31, we've forgotten his promises. If God is for us, who do we believe this? Who can be against us? We have forgotten that he has called us his children, co-heirs with Christ, supposedly supposed to be doing greater things than we saw Jesus perform. A royal priesthood, a chosen people, a holy nation. This is you. This is me. Maybe we need to have some intentional time, which is what we're going to hear on Vision Sunday, to come together and pray together and preach the gospel to ourselves. Maybe we need to come together. Maybe we've sacrificed not being together, but come together. It's why church is important. And remind ourselves what happens inside this church is important too. We come together and remind ourselves, teach ourselves the word. You need to join. Maybe you've been disconnected. You need to join a men's fire team, a small group. Get with people who can remind you of the word of God, preach the gospel to you, sharpen you, hold you accountable. confess to one another. We need to come together and have intentional times. I've said this 3 weeks. You know it's coming. This year is going to be a year where we come together and intentionally pray like they did when they got together here at Derby. Like they did in the last couple chapters. They got together and prayed specifically for things. So we don't forget who we are, the promises that we've been given, and whose we are. Friends, we're going to have an opportunity to respond to this, but here's what I'm going to do. I'm actually going to give you a totally disconnected from this passage of Scripture, a little lanyap sermon. Anybody know what lanyap means, by the way? We had 4 people in the first service. 1 person. I love it. Lanyap, there's no excuse for you to know that. It's a Cajun term. We throw it around all the time in Louisiana. Lanyap means just a little bit extra. Usually it applies to food. You know, I want a little extra, a little bonus over here, a little lanyap. I'm going to give you a little bonus. You know, this morning I want to remind you we're about to kick off a week of deacon nominations. It happens every year. And usually the way it works is that we will kick off this week, and I talk a little bit about what a deacon is, and then we go grab some slips of paper out at the foyer, or maybe send emails, and we just start putting people's names down on a piece of paper and sending them in. And that's not a bad process, but as I begin to pray through this year, God impressed upon my heart, like He is with everything, that we probably need to be more of a people of prayer. And so maybe before we just start slapping names down on a piece of paper, we take just a moment here and remind ourselves about what God said about this important ministry. And 2, we take a week before we even recommend anybody. And once a day, I'm going to provide you a prayer guide. We pray through deacon ministry. There are only 2 positions in the church. Lots of roles and responsibilities in the church. There are 2 that God decided to give us very specific qualifications for qualified men to be set apart, ordained to this ministry. Outside of elders, and pastors included in elders, there is this role, a Dioconai, for deacons. It's a Greek word, loosely translated through the dirt. And in that term, you discover what it is that they're supposed to be doing. Deacons in the ministry of the church are the ones who do the dirty work. I mean, that word in Scripture, Dioconai, means servant, yes, but it means table waiter. Servant, literally like a table servant. We see that term first show up when we get to Acts chapter 6. You see that the disciples and the apostles were having a hard time doing what God had specifically called them to do, devoting themselves to the Scriptures, equipping to teach the people, and spending time in prayer. All of a sudden they looked around and they're thinking, I can't do all of this. The church is growing, and they're arguing about who's getting distributed bread between these Greek-speaking Jews and Hellenist-speaking Jews. We got to find some men who are full of wisdom and full of the Spirit for this role called Dioconai and deacons. And so they counted out men, and here's what their job was: to serve. And here's what I would say. I think sometimes in the church, the reason why I want to take just 1 more minute here and talk about what a deacon is, because I think we have devalued the position of deacon. I think we do that with a lot of things. I think we have devalued sin. We don't hold it to a high enough standard like God does. If we did, we'd probably sin less. Marriage. I don't think anybody has a high enough view of marriage. God takes 2 people and makes them one. Whatever we think of marriage, it could be higher. Look at deacon ministry and we think, oh yeah, those are those guys that are welcoming us and open the doors. Man, they're doing a lot of stuff you don't ever see, and they are indispensable for the local body of believers. And that's true here at Woodbridge. It is a position that God has called men to be a part of. And yes, to serve widows and orphans and help people in the body. That's what we saw in the first century. But you know what? It's more than that. If I were to put it in a first century, in a 2021 context, let me tell you what it is. Deacons serve, yes, as servants, and that means that they are still taking care of widows and orphans. And when you have needs, they're trying to meet those things. They're calling new people and calling regular people they haven't seen in a long time. They are helping serve our ministries to help accomplish what God's called us to do. So when we have a back-to-school resource fair, deacons are here to make that happen. Without them, it can't happen. They're loading backpacks, hundreds of them in here, working the parking lot. You've seen a lot of them as you've come in here. They're hanging screens on the side of the building when we're having outside services. They're doing yard work. They're chopping wood. They're scrubbing floors. They're carrying the offering downstairs. They're filling in for classes when people's teachers don't show up. They're serving the church. They're passing plates. They're doing the Lord's Supper. But even more than those kinds of services, let me tell you another important thing that they do. I heard a pastor say not only are they servants, but they're shock absorbers. You think about the first deacons. Yes, part of their role was to figure out who gets the bread and service, but there was division in the church. Disunity. And one of the ways that God has decided that we'll be evangelistic to the world around us, listen to this, 1 John, was that people would know us by what? Our love for one another. And so not only did these first deacons come in and figure out who gets the bread, they also came in and were a part of God's solution for stopping disunity and division as well. We see deacons who God's given this task. He's given them this task to be shock absorbers. They're protectors of unity in the church. They strive fervently to protect unity, prevent gossip, dispel misinformation, to help encourage biblical, Christ-exalting communication. So here's what I want to do with the rest of our time before we have an opportunity to pray and begin this time of deacon nominations. I want to just share with you what God says are the specific qualifications for deacons. So as we begin to pray this week and we think about who it is that we would nominate and recommend, these are the kinds of men that are called to these positions. One, they must be, 1 Timothy 3, verse 8 through 13, they must be dignified, which means respectable. Not double-tongued, which means their word is trustworthy. Verse 8, they can't be addicted to too much wine. That means a man is disqualified from this office of deacon if he's addicted to substances, has a lack of self-control. He's not greedy for dishonest gain. Verse 9, he's sound in faith and life. It means he knows the gospel. Verse 10, and this is confusing to people, he's blameless. That doesn't mean he's perfect. It means that he lives his life in a way that is above accusation. It's a good overall character. Verse 11 says that he has a godly wife. It means a deacon's wife. We even see it here in verse 11. It says a deacon's wife must also be dignified, not slanderers, but sober-minded, faithful in all things. Must be a husband of one wife, verse 12, and they must manage their children and their household well. God is calling us to open a season where we're trying to identify these men. And let me just tell you this as we close. We need these kinds of men in the church. Most of my time is spent doing things that God has not specifically called me to do. And it's not because our deacons aren't working hard. It's because we don't have enough men serving in the role of deacon. You can't tell me that there isn't 10 to 15 men right now that God's even putting that whisper in your ear like, should be a deacon. We need you. I need you. Our church needs you so that the gospel can go forward here at First Baptist Woodbridge. What you're going to see starting later this evening, if you go to visit fbcw.org/deacon, we'll email it to you as well, is our deacon page. It tells you a lot about what the qualifications are, gives you an opportunity to download that prayer guide, and then next Sunday, online or in person with a slip of paper, you can start giving us nominations for those men. Maybe you're one of them, and I pray you are. It's going to be glorious. Let me pray for us as we have an opportunity to respond this morning in prayer. Father, we thank you. We praise you. We love you. We pray, God, as we come before you in these moments, that we just, we are transparent before you, and that, God, you would speak to us and we would respond. We pray this, Jesus, in your name. Amen.